Exhibit 2, sand flats. C, mud flats. C, tidal flats. C, coastal wetlands. In coastal ecology, Bodega Head, Barber attempts to define Bodega Harbor's environment, which transforms daily, the effects of 2 high tides and 2 low tides. But the more he tries, the more he fails to contain and capture. Quote, to call the major habitat a mudflat is a bit misleading. For some places, sandflat would be a better term, end quote. Without explanation, Barber continues on in the chapter, simply using the word mudflat. Somewhat sheepishly, I point this out to each ecologist when we are out in the field. These categories are ultimately arbitrary, aren't they? I say this to myself, to Jackie, to Aurora, to the group of ecologists at the cottages, over too many glasses of red wine sipped under our masks in the cold dark. Given the core act of collecting data and classifying for the field of ecology, the word arbitrary appears to make some people nervous. The idea that what they study exceeds human attempts at and desire for classification, for neat and tidy boundaries that the natural world appears to gleefully resist. In Ecosystems of California, Harold Mooney and Erica Zalaveta indicate that during the 19th century, wetlands, quote, were referred to by a variety of terms such as swamp, marsh, bog, fen, mire, and moor. These terms are used imprecisely and often interchangeably, end quote. It humors me to see imprecision and interchangeability thrusted onto the past as if to imply that these qualities are due to a lack of knowledge, a lack of technology, a lack of expertise, rather than inherent to the forms under study. At times, the field of ecology appears counterintuitive to me. During an early February walk on the tidal flats with Jackie, I noticed a proliferation of sand dollars. Not the kind that my mom and I often hunted when I was a kid along beach edges with a receding tide. Those were a beautiful ivory, sometimes caked in sediments, but dry and empty, often protruding from the sand like fossil artifacts. It had never occurred to me that sand dollars were ever living, or for that matter, that they could be conceived of as dead. The memories of thrilling finds and problematically excited removals of sand dollars as mother and child bonding is now tinted by the Gothic realization that we were plucking dead organisms from the beach and putting them on display in my grandparents' house where we lived because they were decorative and looked pretty. I asked Jackie why there are so many in this area of the tidal flat. I expect this to be an obvious question, if not a stupid one. I am surprised when she says, that's a good question. I don't know. You could probably do a study to find out. The idea that my asking about the present proliferation of sand dollars could warrant a legitimate ecological experiment does not necessarily boost my confidence in my trespassing in this field. Rather, it makes me realize that though ecology purports and performs a know-it-all posture, very little is actually known. Unlike the ecologists taking me out in the field, I find this openness and extreme partiality of knowledge reassuring. Like I can breathe a sigh of relief in how much of these wetlands and their species refuse to be held and grasped. The tidal flat is flush with living sand dollars, covered in violet, pink, and deep purple velvet spines, cilia, incredibly fine hairs that move and bristle with touch and contact. Their spines brush against my fingertips. On their underside, they possess podia, food grooves with tiny tube feet that move food toward their center, toward their mouths. Sand dollars originally lived on top of seabeds, but eventually evolved into a burrowing organism. They are able to withstand exposure to air and a relative lack of water as the tide leaves for hours each day. They are considered an intertidal species in that they thrive along land-ocean edges in the dynamic, normative transitions exemplified by the tide. Though they normally reproduce through external sexual reproduction, gametes released into the water to be fertilized, sometimes in response to optimal or extremely dire environmental conditions, they will instead clone themselves, increasing their populations for having their physical size. Does it serve me to consider my own transness as a response to the environment that produced me? My grandpa Pete was a terrible father, typically someone home from the VFW drunk to merely serve as the conventional patriarch and strong arm to punish and scare his kids into submission. He came from a long line of alcoholics where his mother even lost custody of him briefly as a baby for accidentally setting his blanket on fire with her cigarette while Pete was wrapped in it. His biological dad, whose last name is Hollenbeck, was never really in the picture, but his uncle Jim Miller eventually attempted to take over guardianship of Pete. He definitely grew up with abandonment issues around his mother, and as soon as he could leave anyone semblance of care, he left for Korea to be a machine gunner, turning 18 on the boat going over. With no real means to deal with PTSD, after Pete married my grandma, he slept with his dad's World War I knife under his pillow every night. Pete softened when I was born, his own edges no longer sharp and jutting as if his punch-drunk demeanor dissolved and pooled into a beer punch that his white tees no longer completely covered. He still drank, even sharing his Coors with me when I was only a couple years old, but he was retired and always around for me to follow, to mimic, and to embrace. Footnote 3. In the mirror stage, Lacan actually turns to the animal kingdom, specifically to pigeons. Lacan writes, "It is a necessary condition for the maturation of the female pigeon that it should see another member of its species, of either sex. So sufficient in itself is this condition that the desired effect may be obtained merely by placing the individual within reach of the field of reflection of a mirror." For Lacan, the illusion and coherency of bodily integrity is predicated upon a notion of sameness at the level of species rather than sex. A female pigeon can develop by simply looking at another pigeon, including a male pigeon. The mirror stage is less about producing the falsehood of bodily integrity in terms of gender and sex than about simply producing a speciated self. That maturation and development, in fact, occurs by regarding another individual, quote, of either sex, so much so that even one's reflection will suffice. Pete was my mirror. The gender that Pete brought me up in was a white, working class, cisgender, heterosexual masculinity. It was all he knew, beyond the fact that he wanted someone to watch Westerns with, to play sports with, to bet on the ponies with, to play poker with, to play fight with. He wanted a gendering with rather than a gendering against. Though it is an important narrative structure and perhaps is even the most conventional or archetypal trans narrative plot, the notion of revision of the past or death of a prior self, usually summed up in the logic of dead naming, the act of using a trans person's birth or former name, a dead name, without their consent, has never been a fit for me. My trans narrative willfully looks to the past and holds its incongruencies with love. I have always flourished in unalignment, in lack of fit, in developing laterally or crabwise. Footnote 4. Ava Hayward and Jamie Weinstein, in their introduction to TSQ's 2015 issue on Tranimalities in the Age of Trans Life, contend that, quote, in its prefixal state, trans is prepositionally oriented, marking the with, through, of, in, and across that makes life possible. Trans life works purposefully crabwise to ontological claims. Trans can be ontological to the extent that it is the movement across precisely vitality itself, end quote. Pete died when I was 15. He was my favorite person. As an adult, I do not know how to reconcile the fact that Pete gave me my gender without his realizing or attending it, and potentially, if still alive, would be completely disgusted by it. I don't know if he was homophobic or if he would be transphobic, but he was conventionally racist and verbally articulated gender in reductive binary terms. He never let my grandma learn how to drive, marking her forever dependent on him, or on the bus when he was in a withholding and punishing mood. In 86 years, my grandma has never once driven a car. It was only after he died that my grandma decided to finally paint the interior of our house, since Pete would never let it be anything but white. Though coldly cisgender, even in the face of my existence, it was an existence he not only cultivated, but adamantly made sure would thrive. An ecotone of this white working class masculine environment was Pete's neighborhood barbershop that was 3 doors down from my elementary school. Every time he got a haircut, he would take me. His barber was a thick-haired Italian guy who had been doing Pete's hair since time immemorial. I enjoyed listening to their gruff voices and vulgar curse words while sitting in my own barber chair drinking a cold can of Coke. Pete's barber always gave me one as soon as I sat down. 4 years after Pete died, Clint Eastwood's Gran Torino came out about an old white racist Korean War veteran who comes to care for his Hmong neighbors more than his own white grandchildren. It's still a film that moves me to tears, mostly because my grandma and I saw it together, and all we could say to each other afterwards was simply repeating, "It's Pete, ain't it? It's Pete." I don't think there were ever good politics in that film that held up then, and certainly not now, but Walt Kowalski was an exact replica of Pete, right down to the Korean War veteran status. There's a barbershop scene in the film where Walt takes his teenage neighbor Tal to the barbershop to learn about how guys talk, which basically amounted to masculine posturing through jibes at each other that demoted each man either to a pussy or a racist epithet. How feminist forward. Walt's whole point is to man up Tal. I cannot tell you what Pete and his barber talked about, and I am more than willing to bet, which I learned from Pete, that their conversations do not bear repeating, and yet I belonged. The barbershop was as much my routine as it was Pete's. We took his red and white Ford pickup the short distance to the shop with the traditional red, blue, and white barber pole basking brightly near the front door in a welcoming fashion. Pete rewarded me when I manned up in third grade after being suspended from school for the afternoon. He bought me ice cream and a stuffed Spuds Mackenzie dog, the Bull Terrier Bud Light mascot. There was a huge controversy in the late 1980s around Spud's rise to advertising fame. He was portrayed as a real guy's guy kind of dog, which somehow lost its charm when people uncovered that Spuds, the boy party dog, was in fact a female dog named Honeytree Evil Eye, Evie for short. The male bravado of a boy dog surrounded by human, cisgendered, straight white women, for which erotic vectors are bizarrely implied, is somehow better, parenthetical, less queer and less trans, than a girl dog playing a boy dog flirting with human women, even though the controversy would have never landed on anyone's radar if it wasn't for the mere discovery of Spud's real name. By the time I was 8, I'd been doing Taekwondo for over a year, because my mom was worried about my social skills and shyness, and because she had read an article about the sport in the Denver Westward. I'd recently learned how to throw someone over my shoulder if they tried to choke me from behind. At recess, a boy named Greg, who regularly taunted me and my gender unalignment, flatly said, "You're going to marry Barney." It was a trivial and weirdly typical moment of childhood bullying. I quipped back, "Well, you're going to marry Big Bird." These insults were thickly layered in queerness. Is it the suggestion for a child to legally and likely sexually bind themselves to a purple dinosaur or to an oversized yellow bird? Is that it? The movement across species categories that produces unease and discomfort? I'm sure Greg and I were merely engaging in a round of boy bravado. We attempted to take each other down by calling into question one another's maturity. At 8 years old, it was no longer acceptable to watch such childish shows like Barney or Sesame Street, because we had all developed into more adult programming, like Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z. I can't help but think how easy it was for us to dress our insults in transphobia, to disregard and render deviant any behavior that transgresses boundaries of speciation and gender in regard to one's desire for self and for an other. What ends up predatory is the horizontal movement across, from human to animal, or animal to human, or from man to woman, or woman to man, or from gender to gender. As with the conventional argument against allowing trans people to use the bathroom they identify and are most comfortable with, the notion that transness is a predatory form of dressing up, which not only negates the realness of transness, but also implies that cisness is somehow not a fabrication, hides the real form of predation. What is creepy about a child marrying an anthropomorphized dinosaur bird is neither the cross-pollination of human, non-human erotics, nor the argument that transness is a deceitful disguise. Instead, it's how these claims veil and obfuscate the non-consensual and violating logics of pedophilia, of child-adult erotics that undergird many of the dynamics between adults and children's on kids' TV programming. What's off-putting is the usually white adult cis man inside the costume grooming young kids on proper behavior, always on the brink of taking advantage. And yet, it is gender transgressions that regularly incite violence, punishment, and course correction. As if I had been the one to cross the line as a not boy, jibing like a boy, Greg decided to choke me. Cue my instincts, my bodily response to predatory threat. I kicked up into Greg's groin, grabbed his arm around my throat and his shoulder, and hoisted him over mine flat on his back, my chest heaving with fear and shock. The move really works. I was eventually brought into the principal's office and my mom was called. We both sat in that room, confused. The principal explained that I was only going to be suspended for the day because I had a pristine record otherwise. My mom walked all three of us back through the incident, trying to understand why I was in trouble and being sent home and Greg was not. The principal expressed concern that I had responded so violently and that when it came down to it, I had physically hurt Greg more than he had hurt me. That was the problem. I never forgot this strange moment of sexism where I acted outside of my perceived gender and was punished for it, which really meant that if you're a not boy and you fight back, you are the one creating trouble. I don't think my mom was thrilled that my afternoon suspension was celebrated by Pete, but she certainly did not get in the way of it. As we wait for the tide to come in on the mudflat so we can get good seagrass samples, CM tells me about another ecology graduate student, Isabel, who studies snails and the concept of transgenerational plasticity, for which she had to fight her white cisgender straight male PI, private investigator, in order to be able to study, even though the concept is now widely accepted. The concept amounts to the ability for an organism, in response to observed potential threats or predators, to transfer better adaptive qualities to their young, even within a single generation. Harder shells, or smaller size, or bigger mouths, to better equip them for the environmental conditions they're being born into. I tell CM it sounds like intergenerational trauma, but protective rather than damaging. Maybe Pete's trauma has become my plasticity.